Alright, let's write another bar chart. This one is from IELTS Academic 15. As usual, we need to spend some time on this statement and understand it. The chart below shows the results of a survey about people's coffee and tea buying and drinking habits in 5 Australian cities. So as you know, the instruction is always the same in writing task 1. We should summarize the information and make comparisons where relevant. So step 2 is to spend some time on the data and understand it. Here we've got 3 categories: bought fresh coffee in last 4 weeks, bought instant coffee, and went to a cafe for coffee or tea. So we start with the first category, bought fresh coffee. We'll look for the highest and the lowest categories, and also we'll look for similarities and differences. So here we have in the first category, the highest is Sydney, and the second highest is Melbourne. We can mention these two together. And after that, Brisbane and Adelaide are also similar, so we can put these two together. Hobart is different, so we mention that separately. The next category is bought instant coffee. The highest here is Hobart, so we will mention that separately. And Melbourne and Adelaide are quite similar, so we mention together. We actually group them. And Sydney is the lowest, and Brisbane also is the second highest, so we mentioned these two cities also separately. And the last category, went to a cafe. The highest is Melbourne, and they're very actually similar, Hobart and Melbourne, so we can mention them together. And Brisbane and Adelaide are also quite similar. We mentioned them together as well. And Sydney is also should be mentioned separately. Now, for our overview, we will mention the highest and the lowest parts. So the most important category here is went to a cafe for coffee or tea, because this category has the highest percentages. So we will mention that first in our overview. And from this category, Melbourne and Hobart are the most important ones. So we only mention these two. From the first category, fresh coffee, Sydney is the highest, so I'll mention Sydney. And from bought instant coffee, I will mention only Hobart, again because this is the highest. So it's time to write. The first thing to write, as usual, is to paraphrase. This is my paraphrase. The bar chart illustrates data on coffee purchasing and drinking behaviors in 5 Australian cities in the last 4 weeks. So I deleted below as usual because there is nothing below my writing. Instead of shows, I used illustrates. Instead of the result of a survey about, I used data on. Instead of coffee and tea buying and drinking habits, I used coffee purchasing and drinking behaviors. I repeated the same phrase in 5 Australian cities, and I got this part in the last 4 weeks from the chart to avoid repeating that again and again in my essay. So this is my model answer. We just read the paraphrase together. Let's read the overview. So if you remember, I said I will mention only the most important parts. Overall, Melbourne and Hobart stand out regarding cafe visits, while Sydney has the highest percentage of fresh coffee consumption. Hobart also shows a strong inclination toward purchasing instant coffee. Now, I'll start mentioning each category one by one as presented. So I'll start with bought fresh coffee. Approximately 44% of residents in Sydney purchased fresh coffee, nearly the same as in Melbourne, with around 42%. So I mentioned these two together. Now the second one. The figures for Brisbane and Adelaide are quite similar, with percentages standing at 33% and 34% respectively. And now the last one. On the other hand, Hobart has a slightly higher percentage at 37%. Now the second category, I write it in a separate paragraph. In terms of instant coffee, Hobart has the highest percentage, around 54%. Now the second one. Adelaide and Melbourne are almost on par with 50% and 47% respectively. And now Sydney. Sydney has the lowest figure at 46%. And now Brisbane, the last one. While Brisbane showcases the second highest percentage, approximately 53%. And now the last category, again, I'll present it separately in a different paragraph. Concerning visiting cafes for coffee or tea, Melbourne leads with the highest percentage, around 63%. Now I'll mention Hobart, which is quite similar, closely followed by Hobart at around 62%. Now, Sydney. Sydney demonstrates a substantial 61% of residents who visited cafes, while Brisbane and Adelaide have the lowest figures of 55% and 49% respectively. So I grouped Brisbane and Adelaide. So I wrote 181 words for this essay, and I organized it in 4 paragraphs. In the first one, I paraphrased the statement and wrote the overview. In the first body, I mentioned the first category. In the second one, I mentioned the second category. And finally, in the last one, I mentioned the last category and mentioned the details and grouped the data and made comparison where relevant. In this slide, you can find the words that I used to describe the changes, most of the language of compare and comparison. And also you can see the words that I used to connect my sentences together. All right, hope you found it useful. Have a nice day.